October 2022. I was in Jamaica for my best friend's wedding. We had stayed at a nice, all-inclusive resort. It was built like a kingdom, with small portions of a village to go to, restaurants, insane pools, clubs, shops, everything. But you could tell it was pretty old with renovations. I was single then and stayed in my own room, though I didn't spend much time in there because we were out doing stuff. Well, when traveling, local food doesn't always agree with me, so one night I stayed in, just trying to find something on the TV to watch. When late at night, someone knocked on my door. I knew my friend might come to check on me at some point, so I figured that it was him. But I opened the door to no one there. The halls were big and wide with marble floors, so you could see in both directions and would surely hear someone running away. Also, the resort had two sides to it, family and singles. I was on the farthest side of the singles side, so I don't think there was any little kids playing pranks. Honestly, I would say it's nearly impossible for someone to knock on the door and hide that quickly without hearing them sneak into another room or something. Oh well, I think. Later, I'm sitting in the bathroom on the toilet because again, the Jamaican cuisine didn't sit well with me, and they actually had a landline telephone on the wall at the toilet. How neat. Well, the phone starts ringing. I pick it up, stunned, and say hello. There was a kind of analog sputtering sound that had no rhythm to it, just clicking sporadically. So I hang up, and at this point, I'm really trying to pretend like both occurrences are just strange coincidences. I told myself if the front desk needed to call me, they would call back. But they didn't. It then occurred to me that I had only heard the phone ring from the bathroom and did not hear the phone by the bed ringing, which shouldn't be the case if anyone was to call this room. Having no way to process this logically, I try to put it out of my mind. I've experienced some strange things before, so I wasn't freaking out, but this was beginning to mess with my peace of mind a bit. Anyway, I ended up getting some not-so-great, sweaty sleep, and feeling better but not great the next morning. I decide to take a long shower with the lights off, something I found very relaxing, when all of a sudden, I hear another 3 knocks at the door. Only this sounded different. It sounded louder, closer. It sounded like it had come not from the front door of the hotel room, but the door to the bathroom. I sat in the darkness in the shower, naked, replaying the sounds of the knock in my head, trying to convince myself that I was wrong. But I wasn't. My brain immediately recognized it as the bathroom door, and I have to trust that. At that point, I knew this was not normal. This hotel room had another visitor. When I mustered the courage to get out of the shower and hurriedly turn on all the lights, I remembered something peculiar had happened earlier in that trip. So throughout the trip, I kept having problems with my key card. I had to have a new key card linked to my door twice, seemingly for no good reason. Once it was 2 a.m, and I was very drunk and sat outside my door for about 20 minutes, waiting for a maintenance guy to come help. He comes and links a new key to my door, and I ask him, "Why does this keep happening?" And he responded, "This is an old resort. Some strange things happen here sometimes." He said this with a bit of a smirk on his face. I have a close friend who used to work as a pool man, and he recently told me this truly terrifying tale. He used to do a lot of pools for clients in a place where most of the homes were used as vacation homes. So most of his clients were, of course, not at home at the time that he did their pool service. So sometimes on particularly hot days, He and his assistant would take a short swim before they treated the pool with all of the chemicals that they had to use. As you probably know, pools are typically treated, or shocked, quote-unquote, with chlorine, and sometimes the chlorine levels may mean that you can't swim in the pool for a day or two after the shock treatment. And this day seemed really hot, especially after the thought of having to work outside, the pool in the heat of the midday sun, whilst seeing the tempting and cool water the whole time. My friend happened to know this particular client quite well, and since said client was out of town at the time, my friend knew that it would be okay if he invited his wife and mother over to swim and have lunch. Since both his wife and his mother lived only a short distance away, they both happily agreed, and soon the family was together enjoying a large sub sandwich with some chips and potato salad together. I guess the old rule about not swimming so soon after you eat is now considered sort of an old wives' tale, because after everyone finished their lunch, my friend took the liberty of being the first one into the soothing, cool water on that uncomfortable and hot day. Not being one to just dive right into the deep end, though, my friend started out in the shallow end and enjoyed the immediate cool down. His assistant, his wife, and his mother were still at the poolside picnic table, cleaning up the leftovers and garbage from their lunch. My friend says that he remembers feeling a very, very slight tingle in his hands and arms, but he wasn't alarmed by it. He was too busy just enjoying the cool water on his hot skin. After a few minutes of relaxing in the shallow end of the large built-in pool, my friend started swimming towards the deep end so that he could totally plunge himself into the water. But just as he was reaching the deeper waters, he started to really notice the tingling sensation getting more intense, and he was now experiencing it in his arms and his legs. He was forced to stop paddling into the deep end, as all of his strength seemed to leave his muscles at once. But it was too late. The tingling sensation was now so bad that he could hardly move at all. As he drifted helplessly into the deep end, he felt a terrifying chill as he realized that he was now unable to touch the bottom of the pool, unable to move an inch. It seemed as though his muscles were all giving out on him at once, and it started to dawn on him that he felt like he was being electrocuted. As my friend began to sink underwater, he tried desperately to break the water's surface for a short breath, and he caught brief glimpses of life just continuing on before him. His mother, his wife, and his assistant were all oblivious to his plight. The situation got even more terrifying when my friend's wife and mother finally noticed that he appeared to be drowning, and they all ran over to the pool, ready to jump in and help. With a burst of strength, my friend managed to choke out, "Don't! I'm being electrocuted," in an attempt to stop them from jumping into the deadly water, or touching him to try and rescue him, and then getting shocked themselves. There was nothing left for his wife, his mother, or his assistant to do, except watch in shock and horror as they realized that they really had no idea how to save him. My friend says that right about then, he started to feel totally drained. Then he started to feel himself giving up. A peaceful feeling began to settle over him as he started to sink. He gazed up at the bright, lively sun shining down on him through the silvery, rippling water, and he felt more at peace in that moment than he ever had before. As a lifetime seemed to pass, my friend sank lower and lower towards the pool's cement bottom. But finally, just as he had almost completely given up on surviving his mysterious and terrifying ordeal, his feet finally made contact with the bottom. That caused him to ground out or something, he said, and that right there, it gave him the life-saving jolt of electricity that he needed to survive. As he shot off the bottom of the pool, he used that last bit of strength in order to save his own life. Fortunately for him, he had somehow drifted closer to the edge of the pool, and that allowed him to get a grip on the side and pull himself up and out, as he shot out of the water, as he put it, in an instant. As he lay there on the pool's edge, catching his breath, he didn't even care about the heat of the cement touching his skin. In fact, he was just grateful to be out of the water. It wasn't until a little while later, after my friend's client got home from out of town, that he finally got to find out what actually happened to him that fateful day. As it turned out, his client had just had a new pool light installed a few feet under the water on the far side of the pool in the deep end, earlier that very same day. Obviously, the light was somehow wired and installed wrong, therefore literally electrocuting my friend as he simply tried to enjoy an afternoon dip on a hot day in the cool pool. He is extremely thankful that he was the first and only one to jump into the pool that day. It just goes to show, at least in my eyes, that danger can often lurk in unexpected places, allowing others around you to be completely and totally oblivious to your dangerous situation. Not only that, but it also alarms me just how quickly anyone's life can change, or even end, at any given moment. Growing up, my cousin and I spent a lot of time together. We were the type that would get in trouble for laughing and giggling well after the midnight hour. We often stayed at our grandparents' house, out in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina. At the very end of the dirt road that their house was off, there was a very old, dilapidated house with a haunting history. According to our pawpaw, via the previous landowner, the house was the property of a woman left after the remaining members of her family had long passed. She dabbled in things occult-related and was said to have practiced black magic, curses on people, and using the gift she was said to have for negativity. She kept to herself and was ridiculed, unwelcome at the time with the small town that inhabited the area. After a very negative encounter with someone in a local shop, she was said to have gone home, created a new curse, and then took her life to finalize the hex on the home and the land. Any future inhabitants of her home would experience paranormal, and some even said demonic, activity. One night, as we were having a sleepover, my cousin, who we will call T, and I decided that it would be a good night to visit the haunted house at the end of the dirt road. We waited until our grandparents fell asleep, which all we had to listen for was the loud and obnoxious snoring of Pawpaw. Once we heard the infamous snoring, we knew we were home free. So, dressed in all black clothing, we snuck foot first out of the bedroom window. It was approximately 1:45 a.m. On the way to the house, we joked and played around with one another, our conversations based on the fact that we were finally going to see the house, after years of talking about going, sneaking out and trying to hunt a ghost. We were beyond excited, so to speak. When we arrived at the house, flashlights lighting up the front exterior, we spotted the way in. Luckily, it was the front door. This door was hanging loosely on its last hinge, a joke of a door, to be honest. T and I pulled at the door, and it came off its last hinge completely. Together we laid on what was left of the front porch and shined our lights into the room. This room was missing part of the floor that over time had sunken into the earth, and plants had begun inhabiting the room. We entered anyway. Touring the home, we began to discuss what we imagined it looked like in the past. The area we supposed was the kitchen we lined in our imaginative conversation with wooden cabinets and a gas stove. Around the corner of what was at one time the kitchen, I spotted a very narrow and steep staircase leading up. Neither of us had ever seen such a staircase before. I shone my light on it and called T to come look at what I had discovered. Brave as we were then, we decided that it was a good decision to climb up and see what we found. As we climbed the stairs, we both froze in place, as we heard what sounded like a woman scream, as loud as she possibly could. Standing there, eyes wide, skin crawling, and hearts pounding, we both pointed our lights in the direction of the scream, but the light landed on just a wall. We then laughed that awkward laugh, the one that says we heard that, but it was something explainable, and with just our eyes deciding that we would keep climbing. As we reached the top of the stairs, we entered a room. This room looked as though it were not attached to the same run-down, ruined house that we entered. There were papers scattered upon the floor, symbols painted on the wall. Neither of us understood, but today, just the symbols on the wall would have caused me to tuck tail and run. They were symbols of conjuring, symbols that called upon dangerous entities. Back then, we saw them as bad artwork and just laughed. At this time, I would have cleansed myself upon leaving. T stepped forward as I warned her that based on the dilapidation of the rest of the home, to be weary of where she stepped. As she crossed safely, I followed behind, and as I did, the floor began creaking and almost screaming under my feet. I took 6 steps toward T when the area of the floor I was standing on collapsed, and down we both fell, the flooring landing on us both. T was able to wiggle her way out, but I was stuck. There was no way I was pulling myself out from under the flooring, as most of it landed upon me. And to make the situation worse, a huge piece of the floor blocked the only safe way in and out of the house. As T struggled to move the flooring off me, causing bursts of pain from my knee, I analyzed our situation, trying to come up with an escape plan. Neither of us had phones. Only one of us now had a flashlight, and we were not supposed to be there at all. This night took a terrifying turn quickly. In the back of our minds, we never forgot the scream. I locked eyes on a small window just big enough for T to get out of. I pointed this out and handed her my flashlight as she turned and made her way out the window, pulled herself up and put her feet out. Slipping outside, she left me in the complete empty, full of possibilities and darkness. My scanning of the room in panic was interrupted by T yelling out in pain. I called out to her asking what happened, and she informed me that under the window, what was referred to as sticky briar bushes. So she slid out the window, dropped about 5 feet directly into thorns. I could hear her call out in pain as she struggled to rip herself out of the bushes and into freedom. Continuously scanning the room, allowing every shadow darker than the next to cause my heart to accelerate, I spotted something. Something that was not in place. A silhouette of a woman crouched in the corner, staring at me. Beyond terror at this point, I called out to T, asking where she was. As I watched the silhouette stand up and take 1 step towards me, I screamed. T replied with a scream of her own as she inched her way out of the briars. "I'm out," she yelled at me, but I was shocked, frozen, words unable to come out. I swear my mouth moved. Hurry. But nothing came out as the silhouette moved closer and closer. I shut my eyes tight and started trying to pry myself free, each tug and pull causing a searing, ripping pain through my thigh. But I wanted away from the shadow in the corner, the shadow that wanted me. I could feel all throughout me that I was in harm's way. I could feel the negativity of this silhouette emitted. Finally able to produce my voice, I screamed in a panic for T to hurry up, to come back, to save me. I opened my eyes, and the silhouette was no longer a dark shadow form. She had features, transparent, but I could make out the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the long black hair. She was so close, I could smell the death on her. Closing my eyes again, I started crying. I was so terrified. I questioned everything that I had ever believed. The shock to my system in that moment had caused every limb in my body to run ice cold, and my fight or flight kicked in as I began to fight. I pulled and tugged through the pain as I released my leg from under the flooring. T's flashlight hit me, and I opened my eyes finally as the woman shifted back into nothing but shadows. T was standing there, staring into the empty space that the woman stood in, her eyes never leaving the wall. She saw her too, the last of her. I watched her the entire time I was there. To this day, I have never spoke with T about the woman, because what is there to say? Did you see her too? That doesn't do that moment any justice. I know she saw her, and I know she was as petrified with fear as I was. We made it back to our window and back onto the air mattress bed right before our grandparents woke for church. Lying, our faces covered, pretending to have been asleep the entire time, we denied joining them for church, stating that T had a bad headache, and I was going to stay and take care of her. Once they left and we were sure that they would not turn around for something forgotten, we threw the blankets down and assessed our injuries. T was covered in thorn prickles, and I had 3 gashes and what looked like claw marks on the inside of my thigh, blood seeping through the rips in my jeans. We patched each other up, and though we knew the gashes in my leg most likely needed stitches, we did the patching ourselves and never told a soul. I still wear scars on my right thigh, to the side above the kneecap. A permanent memory seared into the eyes of the shadow woman in my mind, forever. I still dream of her, and when I do, she's asking me to return to the house. Or she's fading into view, her features becoming prominent from the shadows. Even in my dreams, I feel the evil that she eludes. I feel the terror, and I'll wake up sweating. My sleep paralysis moments always involve her. Have I carried her all this time? Rewind back to around 2010. I was about 9 or 10 years old, and it was a lovely summer's evening in the Midwest. My buddy, who I'll call Chase for this story, invited me and 2 of my other friends in the neighborhood over for a sleepover. Like I said, we were at an age where close adult supervision was starting to slip, and Chase's house was a great spot for unsupervised shenanigans. Chase was adopted by a relatively older couple. I remember his parents being in their late 50s, while most of the rest of ours were in their late 30s, early 40s. His father was paralyzed from the legs down while serving in the Gulf War and required caretakers, and his mom was some kind of business executive who wasn't in town too much. In addition to this, Chase's only sibling was much older, and we had already moved out for college by this time. So whenever we were hanging out there was almost never any eyes on us. We never did anything bad, but typical stupid stuff you would imagine kids at the time would do. Shooting airsoft guns, putting all kinds of crazy seasonings in an instant ramen, staying up late playing M-rated games that none of us had yet. That kind of stuff. Chase's house was also by far the biggest house in the neighborhood too, sitting on top of a hill with a gate, a big long driveway, and a huge yard that surrounded the perimeter of the house that backed into a wooded area which eventually led into a state forest. This one particular night, Chase has the idea that we should set up a tent in the woods and camp out for the night. While I don't think any of us were jumping out of our skin to do this, We all complied on the condition that we stayed at the edge of the woods so we could use the bathroom and get snacks easily from the house. We set the tent up, laid out our sleeping bags, grabbed as much junk food as physically possible, and hung out in the tent for the night. We goof around for a few hours even after the sun sets until the sugar high dies off and the unhealthy food settles in. We one by one start to fall asleep. I was usually the first one to crash at sleepovers, and tonight was no different. However, this sleep was not for long. I get woken up by someone shaking me out of the pitch black. As my eyes adjust, the concerned face of my friend comes into focus. Before I can chew him out for waking me up, he says, "Do you hear that?" I sat up and carefully until I hear the noise he's talking about, noticing another one of my friends was awake too. It was a whistle. Somebody out in the woods was whistling. Each whistle was drawn out and breathy, followed by another equally drawn-out note. Even writing about this now still gives me goosebumps. From the sounds of it, it wasn't that close but not that far either. I'm sure my expression turned to that of horror as my other friend woke the last friend up. We all sit in silence and listen for a minute to try and determine the direction of the whistling. It could have been coming from the house. Maybe one of Chase's dad's caretakers decided to stay the night, which didn't usually happen. But it didn't take long for us to realize that the whistling was coming from the woods. And not only was it coming from there, it was getting closer to us. With that, we were out of there. It probably took us 15 seconds to get our shoes on and sprint to the front porch. We left everything in there. Our snacks, pillows, sleeping bags, DS's, and we did not dare to go back. Under the light of his heavily illuminated driveway, which was basically a mini parking lot, we all gained a newfound confidence. At this time, we managed to convince ourselves that we weren't scared, so we got our airsoft guns from the garage and started taking trash and shooting into the woods, basically trying to intimidate or shoot whoever was out there. As we were yelling like a bunch of idiots, we weren't able to hear anything. But at some point, when we cooled down, we listened intently and still heard nothing. Knowing that, we were satisfied and we went to sleep on the floor of his living room after playing a little bit of Xbox. While that experience was creepy, what was really terrifying is what happened the next morning. We all woke up and started talking about how creepy everything that happened last night was, and under the light of day, made the walk down to the tent. As we got closer, we noticed something looked off about the tent. It had been completely trashed. The rain tarp had been mostly pulled off, and it looked like one corner of the tent had caved in, like someone broke one of the poles. Yeah, we had left in a hurry, but it felt hard to believe 4 10-year-olds could do this much damage. Making our way over to the front of the tent, my face dropped when we saw the true extent of the carnage. Everything inside was trashed. Our snacks had been dumped out and seemingly stomped on. Several of the sleeping bags and pillows had been thrown into the woods. Chase's DS had been snapped in half, and worst of all, one of the sides of the tent had slits all along the side of it, as if some psycho had a stabbing frenzy when he realized there was nobody in there. All of us said shockingly little about it, despite all of the bravado we had been boasting about how we scared off whoever was in the woods the previous night and earlier that morning. The 4 of us packed up the tent. We got back on our bikes and headed home. Nobody mentioned it to their parents, partly out of fear of trouble and partly to delegitimize what had just happened. Chase's family probably never would have used the tent again anyways, and I'm sure he had to convince his parents to buy him a new DS, as he said he lost his. After this sleepover, we all kind of naturally separated as friends. It was at the end of summer of 5th grade, and Chase ended up going to a private middle school, while the rest of us went to a public school, which we were then separated into different cliques there. I never thought about the incident again until I ran into one of the other friends there recently when I went back in my hometown visiting family. After catching up, we exchanged numbers, and recently, after seeing a Reddit thread about submitting your own scary stories, all of these memories came rushing back. I texted him asking if he remembers that night, and he calls me right after and basically lays out every single detail, exactly as I remembered it. Immediately after, I spent the last half hour writing all this down in my phone. If there's any takeaway from this, it's you should always stick to that instant gut instinct you get when something seems off. Because if it seems like it, it probably is. I'm starting to think that the Olympic National Forest isn't the best place for me to get my outdoor fix. For some context, I'm not a big guy. I am average height with a lanky build. Maybe that has something to do with this part, or maybe it's something else that has ingrained that habit into me. But if I'm in the woods, dead or alive, you won't catch me without a sidearm. Several years ago, a friend of mine admitted what her parents called camping was equivalent to going to a hotel. Coming from a long line of outdoorsmen, I jumped at the opportunity to get someone out in nature properly. We started off slow, pitched tents in the backyard, then moved onto a glamping-style campground, then to a less fancy area, and eventually into the bona fide, untamed wilderness. All was well. I headed up early and cleared the spot, a flat area on top of a mountain. I got the dogs situated, started a campfire, and did my best to make the space as welcoming as I could, in hopes to comfort my friend's nerves. My wife, my friend, and my friend's husband drove up, and we all remarked about the view and the location. All went well that first night. Some deer and a couple of early morning dirt bikers came through, but nothing off-putting. It was in the peak of summer, and while this spot was beautiful, it lacked a nearby water source. Their 2 dogs, ours, and all the humans piled into my truck as we went in search of a creek. This might be a good time to explain how I find camping and fishing spots. Since I prefer to be far away from people, I hop on Google Maps and pick a general area. I zoom in and follow logging roads around to see if I can get where I want to go, plunk down in a location pin to get the coordinates, and boom, off we go. Finding this creek was no different. One of the downsides of that method for finding locations is the satellite images may not be good representation of how that area presently looks though. Sure enough, the path to the creek was not ideal. Instead of everyone getting out to see if there was a viable spot, I volunteered to go see if the path was worthwhile for us, especially with 4 excited dogs to unload and walk down there for. After some ways down, it was apparent that too many trees had fallen and blocked the path for this to be an easy trek for someone already being pushed to their limit with the outdoors. I head back, enjoying the clean air and welcomed breeze on the hot day. I round the bend, grass nearly 6 feet tall to both sides of me, but a few feet wide of a decent path up to the road where we parked, just up the hill. I don't remember what I was thinking about in that moment, but what I will never forget is that sound. A sound that shook me to my core. You ever hear a sound bite of a mountain lion for a movie or a show? Well, I'll be damned if what I heard less than 10 yards from me didn't sound exactly like that. There was no mistaking it. It was only me out there while the rest were inside the truck. That cougar sounded off because of me. I was being warned, and neither of us were happy about it. Immediately, I spun a 180 to face what I didn't want to see, only to see nothing. You know, I think that was worse than if I had seen it on the path. When I spun around, like some old Western cowboy moves, I reached for my holster, unclipped it, and had the weapon pulled out by the time I was done with my terrified ballerina moves. It was somewhere in that tall grass, and while I couldn't see it, I have no doubt that it could certainly see me. Lovely. I walk backwards up the hill, praying I didn't trip over a rock or something and fall, just so this big cat can show me its vocals weren't the only thing that would be piercing my heart that day, all the way up to the road. I'm sure that was quite the sight for the group, seeing me emerge onto the road, walking backwards with a weapon in my hand. Come to find out, I had been gone for long enough. They even discussed how would I communicate with them if I got into trouble. Instead of having a laugh about it, I opened the truck door, got in, shut the door, and then holstered my 9mm when typically I would have done so before opening the door. I don't remember who asked, but someone asked what happened or something to that effect. All I remember saying was, "We aren't going down there," before turning the truck around and driving off. I wish I could tell you that is where the story ends, but unfortunately, it's not. We head back to camp. It's about a 7-mile drive, and it's about 3 miles as the crow flies from that creek, up and down a few mountainsides and windy roads. We move on from the experience after one word answers any question they had. Cougar. We make dinner and forget about it for the most part. I try to, but fail. Night arrives and we are hanging out by the campfire. I'm doing my best to not draw attention to the fact that I'm incessantly scanning our surroundings. After a while, I think I'm just paranoid. Sure, it wasn't happy with me, but I'm not prey, right? And we are a handful of loud folks with a roaring fire and 4 decent-sized dogs. It's all in my head, I thought. The gait of an animal, the way they walk. It's easy to confuse some animals for others, but big cats? Nothing moves like a big cat. And sure as hell, why do I see crossing the only road to go to, and from our camp about 100 yards away, lit up only by the moonlight, and the confirmation to my fears? That wasn't a bear, not a coyote. Nothing slinks through the night like that except for one thing. My dear old friend, the mountain lion. I had officially been slapped with the reminder that humans aren't at the top of the food chain out here. The realization that the saying, "They are more afraid of you than you are of them," is something only said by someone who hasn't been stalked for several miles and several hours later, after driving a vehicle and leaving virtually no trail behind. The reminder that I was the outsider, and I was the one trespassing. We slept in our vehicles that night. While I'll eventually make my way out to the woods again, I think it's safe to say my friend decided the wilderness maybe was a little too wild sometimes. For anyone, no matter your experience level, that is planning to head into nature soon, enjoy the peace it brings. But never forget, out there, you are nothing more than a visitor in someone else's home. This story takes place several years ago. I'm now a 20-year-old female, but at the time I must have been around 16. That being said, the dialogue may not be completely accurate, but I will recall the conversation the best I can. My mom and I were at Walmart getting groceries, and while we were standing in line to check out, my mom noticed the guy behind us only had like 2 items in his hands, and we had way more, so she asked if he wanted to go ahead of us. When I turned to look at the guy my mom was talking to, I know this sounds cliche, but I immediately got a terrible feeling about him. It wasn't really anything about his physical appearance that scared me. It was just his eyes. He was just a middle-aged white guy, wearing a hoodie and a beanie. I didn't even want to make eye contact with him, because something about the look in his eyes scared me. So I just turned back around. The guy replied to my mom, "No thanks, I'm not impatient about anything. I just got out of prison after 27 years. My heart dropped as he said this, but then he added, "For a crime I didn't commit." That last statement helped slightly with my racing heart, but I still just knew something was off about this man, and I considered that he could have been lying. My mom just said something like, "Wow, that's a long time." And he responded, "Yep. Have you heard about the Donald Whalen case?" My mom said she hadn't, and the guy said something like, "That's kind of surprising, because it's pretty well known in central Illinois." He then went on to tell us that his name is Donald Whalen, and his father had been murdered almost 30 years ago, and he had been charged with it, which is why he was in prison for 27 years. He seemed almost proud of it, which also threw me off. My mom continued talking to him about it, but I still didn't engage with him. I was thankful I was still a teenager and he was an adult, because it made me feel like I wasn't obligated to talk to him, so I just let my mom handle it. My mom is a very friendly person who likes to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. She talked to him longer than I would have. He said something like, "Yeah, if you look up Donald Whalen, Bloomington, Illinois, you can learn more about it. There's a video on YouTube of them releasing me from prison." My mom continued talking to him about how crazy it is that he was incarcerated unjustly for so long, until it was our turn to check out, and we left the store after that. As soon as we got to the car, we Googled his name, and found out it was really recent that he was released from prison. Apparently, from my understanding, he was granted a new trial and was released on bond after there was new DNA discovered on the pool cue that was found near his father's body. The murder took place in downtown Bloomington, Illinois in 1991, in a bar that was owned by William Whalen, Donald's father. In the car, I asked my mom if she really believed he was innocent, and she said yes. I didn't argue much about it with her. I just said, "Something's really off about him, though. I feel like he's definitely done something evil, whether it was murdering his father or not." My mom said something about how some people who have been in prison for a long time may just give off bad energy, just from being in that environment for so long. I said, "Yeah, that's true, but I still know in my gut that it was more than that with this guy." By the way, for anyone listening to this who may want to look up more information about this case, his name is spelled like the animal whale, but with the letter N after it. I kept researching more about it, and I also asked my dad if he knew anything about it. It turns out that sometime after the murder, probably years later, my dad had worked in the same bar that the murder took place. My dad said that from what he heard from coworkers and others who frequented the bar back when, Donald Whalen had been a drug addict, and he had murdered his father to rob him at the bar he owned. My dad was fully convinced that this was true, so that further convinced me that my suspicions were justified. I continued looking into the case in the following months, and I found out that he was sent back to prison to complete his 30-year sentence, along with an additional 3 years. During his few months that he was out of prison, he had violated the terms of traveling to places outside of where he was supposed to be while out on bond. But the other charge he received was a domestic battery charge, and he had unlawfully restrained a woman. About a year ago, I went back to the YouTube video of him being released from prison and read the comments. Multiple people in the comments were saying that they had met this guy in various public places, just like my mom and I had. Apparently, he was all too eager to talk about his father's murder and his time in prison. That seems like a weird thing to brag about and bring up to everyone you just met, but I digress. As far as I know, he is still in prison. Even though it's still not clear whether he was the one who murdered his father, it is good to know that my original suspicion that something was off about him was correct. Those charges he accrued in just a few months of being out of prison proved he's someone who probably deserves to stay there. For all I know, we could have met him the same day that he restrained that woman. Always trust your intuition. I'm currently a student living in southwestern Ontario in a small rural municipality by the name of Norfolk County. I live out in the country with my family on my father's property near the town of Waterford, Ontario. Aside from the stereotypical rural pastimes, the farm chores, the school drama with what basically surmounts to knowing the entire generation of kids your age in the area, and trying to keep yourself both sane and able to graduate and get out of the area as fast as possible, there isn't really much to do. We keep animals, chickens, goats, a couple horses, even some peacocks. But aside from that, I basically just mind my studies and spend my time scanning through my phone and listening to podcasts. I love creepypastas, and I've been an active listener since I found this channel a few years ago. A while back, I came across something that I could not believe. Not because I didn't think it was possible, but because the same thing happened to me. And as I listened, I was floored when I found out that it happened in my hometown, probably to someone I know, but they didn't give any inkling as to who they might be. It took me a while to work up the courage to sit down and write this all out. But after I showed this to my other friends who witnessed this thing, they pushed hard for me to do so. And so here I am. One evening, my friends Emma, Sarah, and I decided to take a break from our schoolwork and go for a drive. We're kind of goody-goodies, no troublemakers, although my parents wouldn't believe that if they heard me say it. Just some girls who enjoy the simple things and try to stay out of the shenanigans everybody else our age seems to get involved in. That night, we drove through the Norfolk County countryside, the harvest moon casting an eerie, red glow over the fields of corn and the trees that lined the road. It was the perfect night for a drive, and the autumn air was crisp and refreshing. We were chatting and laughing, our conversations consisting of the usual teenage banter. Emma was in the front seat beside me, and Sarah was in the back, scrolling through her playlist to find the perfect song. We had no idea that our peaceful night was about to take a terrifying turn. We decided to take a detour to a spot that we loved near the edge of the forest, where an old abandoned barn stood. It was a place we had visited many times during the day, but never at night. The barn was said to be haunted, but we never took those stories seriously. We thought it would be fun to explore a bit and take pictures in the moonlight. As we approached the barn, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, and a thick mist began to roll in from the fields. I parked the car, and we stepped out, the crunch of gravel under our feet echoing in the silence. The barn loomed ahead of us, its weathered wood glowing faintly in the moonlight. We made our way towards the entrance, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the barn was filled with shadows, the beams of our lights revealing piles of old hay and rusted farming equipment. We started to explore, our laughter echoing off the walls. Suddenly, Sarah stopped and pointed towards the far corner of the barn. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Emma and I turned our flashlights in the direction she was pointing. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, I saw it. A figure just barely visible in the dim light, standing completely still. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed to blend into the darkness. My heart began to race as I realized it was watching us. "Who's there?" I called out, feeling kind of silly as I tried to sound tougher than I am. There was no response. The figure remained still, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a chill ran down my spine. "We should go," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "Now." We started to back away slowly, keeping our flashlights trained on the figure. But as we moved, it began to follow us, its movements slow and deliberate. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, its hulking presence radiating a menacing sense of predatory thirst and dread. As we reached the entrance of the barn, the figure stopped. For a moment it seemed to hesitate. Then it let out a low, guttural growl that sent us running. We sprinted back to the car, our footsteps pounding against the gravel. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the doors. We scrambled inside, locking the doors behind us. I started the car and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we sped away from the barn. None of us spoke for a long time, the silence in the car filled with only the sound of our ragged breathing. When we finally reached the safety of my house, we sat in the driveway, trying to process what had just happened. None of us could believe what we had seen. We came face to face with something straight out of a nightmare. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe there was something out there. Perhaps all those fairy tales we grew up hearing with stories of ghosts and ghouls and werewolves stalking the borders of far-flung farmlands had some truth to them. We didn't know what it was or why it was there, but we all agreed on one thing. We would never go back to that barn at night again. That night, our safe, familiar world was forever changed by the realization that sometimes there are things lurking in the darkness that we cannot explain, and that some stories, no matter how unbelievable they may seem, are rooted in a terrifying reality. I grew up in a small New England town drenched with history and their old world charm. Among the host of historical places, there stood one, the old mill house, which was really more unsettling than the rest, being a relic from times past. It was abandoned and crumbling. It was a mill in the late 1800s, and the townsfolk used to tell how haunted it was. Of course, most people dismissed this as a rumor. Well, to a teenager, the call to explore abandoned places was exciting. An old mill house had made it onto the top of our list. That rather crisp October night finally came, when we thought it was time to find out what really had become of those rumors. Armed with flashlights and our heads full of adventure, we set out to get into the decaying building. The night was pitch black, moonless. It seemed like the backcloth for that perfect ghost story. The status of the old mill house seemed to grow in stature the closer that we got to it against the dark sky. The trees nearby whispered symphonies to us with their rustling leaves as the wind stirred through, beckoning us closer. My friends Jake and Emily were as excited as me, though in their eyes I could feel a little envious nerve. We entered the old house from the front door. The floorboards creaked under our feet. The atmosphere was heavy, like soup, full of dust and mildew. The flashlights probed very long shadows on the walls, lightening up the peeling wallpaper and the broken panes of glass on the windows. I couldn't help feeling that there was a oppressed atmosphere around us, as if the house itself was alive and knew of our presence. We wandered into the rooms and gathered pieces of the past, old furniture covered in cobwebs, papers lying on the floor, and rusty tools the workers at the mill had left behind. It was unsettling to reach deeper into the mill as we were being watched. Yet nevertheless, nobody was in sight. We came to the basement area of the mill, where the old machinery used to be. The air became much colder, and I felt a chill down my spine that I couldn't describe. Jake, ever the skeptic, laughed nervously. "This place is creepy, but I really don't see ghosts," he said, as if he were trying to lighten the mood. Emily was visibly shaken, though. "I don't like this, guys. Let's just go." Ignoring her plea, we pressed on, curiosity getting the better of us. At the very end of this basement, an old wooden door showed itself to us, ajar. Pushing it open, we found ourselves in a rather small and darkened room. In the middle sat a large stone, round in shape, etched with strange symbols. It looked to be some kind of ritualistic altar. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My flashlight flickered and then went out. I heard Emily gasp in the sudden darkness. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, even though I really wasn't sure what that was. The next thing that happened was that the temperature dropped again, and we could see our breath misting in the cold air. A faint, ethereal light began to emanate from the stone, illuminating the room with an otherworldly glow. We stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Then suddenly, there was an increase in illumination, and a figure began to take shape above the stone. It was a woman, her form translucent, clad in a tattered, old-fashioned dress. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken and consumed by sorrow. She reached out towards us. Her hand passed through the air like mist. "Help me," she whispered, the words echoing in that tiny room. Jake had turned white, and he recoiled to stumble over a loose floorboard. Emily clutched my arm tight, her eyes wide with fear. The ghostly figure stretched out a hand, her eyes pleading, desperate. "Help me find my child," she said again, this time hardly above a whisper. We finally snapped out of our trance and bolted for the stairs, scrambling to get out of the basement. Outside, we didn't stop running until well out of breath. Behind us stood the old mill house, staring back at us in dark windows that resembled empty eyes. We were shaken and perplexed by the encounter. We never spoke about it to anyone, fearing that no one would believe us. That was an experience as real gets, and the one that would haunt us for many years to come. It was later that we learned about Maggie, a lady who once owned that mill and who, on a fateful night, mysteriously lost her only child. Margaret herself spent her entire life searching for her missing child, and she died, eventually from heartbreak. We had disturbed the restless spirit, forever confined to the old mill house. in search of the child she never found. To this day, I cannot drive past that old building without a chill running down my spine to remind me of the night we came face to face with the supernatural. That haunted mill property is something that I will never be able to forget. It's an experience that will be forever etched into my memory. In order to understand my motivations, here is some context. I am a 35-year-old woman who lives alone in a house with my cat. I am also exceedingly neurotic and tend to think overly philosophically about everything. I am neurodivergent in several ways, but what's most important to this story is that I have extreme ADHD, a very high IQ, insomnia, and a chronic anxiety disorder. Given that I have always been like this, I tend to find ways to focus and use these disorders to my advantage, rather than letting them control me. When I am rewatching my favorite movies or TV shows to catch things I missed, I used to try and get them written down on my iPhone Notes app. As you might be able to guess, a lot of the times I have a good idea, it's floated away before I can start typing. Ergo, I have taken to recording audio notes for myself to try and catch more of my particularly interesting streams of consciousness. Some of these are really funny because it sometimes catches the moments an idea floats away momentarily, followed by a subsequent frustration. Some of these are too obvious to be saved as a new idea, and some aren't a fully formed idea yet. But hearing my voice say them keeps it in my brain much easier to come back to. As a result, when I can't sleep, I will be enjoying my scotch and watching one of my nerdiest favorites. When I record notes, I immediately listen to it to decide if it was good enough to come back to in the morning to reevaluate. A few months ago, I was rewatching the Hunger Games movies, and this stream of consciousness related to a sliding scale of apathy that defines the differences between characters. It's essentially two Gaussian curves, one for the capital and one for the districts. Outliers are obvious to those who know the story. Effie has an increasing empathy in her character arc, while the most empathetic character, Katniss, has to gain a level of apathy to succeed. I took an audio note just after midnight when I know I was babbling on for at least a minute about a spectrum of apathy. So, I immediately listened to the note, home alone, with no lights on, and several glasses of scotch deep. On this one, something ridiculously strange got picked up. It caught my voice and my words for about 11 seconds before my voice vanished into essentially a void of sound. Even stranger, the rest of the video is filled with bizarre EVP kinds of sounds, especially with the same thing everyone has heard. Sounds like growling, demonic growling. This happens the rest of the video, and not a single word or sound I am making comes back. Upon my first listen at those 11 seconds in, my heart briefly stopped. My blood ran cold. I got chills all over my body that I just felt again writing this, and I lost the ability to breathe. I know this is long, but I'm trying to put yourself in my shoes at that moment. I already know that the paranormal realm is real, but I have a ridiculously high scare tolerance because my favorite pastime is marathons of scary movies, alone, in the dark, in the wee hours of the morning. I don't get scared much, but this shook me to my core. I saved that audio note along with the next one, where you can hear my voice uncharacteristically freaking out, and I say something to the effect of, "Next thought. If it picks up my voice this time instead of the ghost that might be living in my house with me." What the hell was that? followed by my mindless babble that clearly stopped the arc of epic thoughts in their tracks. It is almost certainly an audio glitch, but if you could hear my video, it scares the crap out of everyone. I can tell you it's unlike anything I have ever heard, and my sound editing savvy friends haven't quite made sense of it. So an audio glitch that happened for no discernible reason for the first time and has never happened again. An audio glitch is likely, but why did it happen? If you're wondering, no, I am not scared and not moving out of my beloved house. Everyone thinks I am insane, but I have knowingly fallen asleep 6 feet from a paranormal entity in a haunted hotel suite, along with spending 2 nights alone in famously haunted graveyards during my earlier search for my first paranormal experience. Also, I obviously listen to Being Scared and a few other channels to fall asleep every night. By my logic, if an entity has lived with me for years without any other experiences, it's almost certainly harmless. Plus, I actually would be one of those people to knowingly purchase a haunted house because the creepy is my comfort zone. If there's a way to share the audio, let me know. Now, if anything else happens, my blasé attitude might change. Sleep well, everybody. Don't let the bed bugs or the demons bite.